Get out! Before I call security and have you dragged out of this mansion like trash. Judith Miller spat, the scent of expensive gin and pure malice hitting my face like a physical blow. She didn't even care that it was our first wedding anniversary. She didn't care that her son Jameson stood there like a coward. She simply pointed her diamond-studded finger toward the door. You've been living off our name for a year, Samantha. But that's over. You're nothing more than a gold digger from the streets of Ohio. And today I'm taking my son back. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I didn't cry. I had spent 365 days holding back those tears, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction now.
Not yet, because Judith didn't know one thing.
She thought she was the one holding the power because her husband left her a real estate empire. What she didn't realize was that I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom she so desperately tried to protect. But let's go back. Let's go back to how this nightmare started. And how I spent a whole year letting her think she had won. I met Jameson in a small coffee shop in downtown Chicago. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a tattered hoodie and reading a book on architecture. He seemed normal, kind, a little broken maybe. I was working 2 jobs, finishing my degree in urban planning and living in a studio apartment that smelled like old radiator steam. We fell in love over cheap lattes and long walks by the lake. When he finally told me his last name was Miller, as in Miller Global Developments, I didn't care. I honestly didn't. I loved the boy who forgot to tie his shoes, not the heir to a billion-dollar throne. But the moment I stepped into their estate for the first time, I knew I had stepped into a shark tank. Judith Miller didn't greet me with a hug. She didn't even stand up. She sat in her velvet armchair, looking me up and down like I was a stain on her Persian rug. Jameson, she'd said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness.
She's cute, in a common sort of way. Tell me, Samantha, does your family own anything?
Or are you just hoping to own ours? Jameson had laughed it off. Mom, stop it. She's brilliant. She's going to be a top urban planner. Judith just smirked. Urban planning. How charming. Designing parks for people who can't afford to live in them. How noble of you. From that day on, it was psychological warfare. She didn't want me in the family. She wanted a socialite. She wanted a girl whose father was a senator or a CEO. Instead, she got me a girl who grew up in foster care, who had to fight for every single cent she ever earned. When Jameson proposed, I thought things would change. I thought she'd see how much I loved him. But instead, she turned the heat up. You'll sign a prenup, of course, she told me over tea a week before the wedding. She pushed a thick stack of papers across the marble table. It basically says you get nothing. No alimony, no house, no shares. If you leave with the clothes on your back. If you love him for him, this shouldn't be a problem, right? I looked her dead in the eye and signed it without reading a single page. I didn't need their money. I had my own plans. Plans that Judith couldn't even fathom. The wedding was a disaster. She invited 500 of her closest friends and made sure I felt like a guest at my own funeral. She even wore white. Can you believe that? A floor-length, shimmering white gown, trying to outshine the bride. She spent the entire night telling people I was a charity project Jameson had picked up. He's always had such a soft heart for the underprivileged. I overheard her telling a group of laughing socialites near the champagne fountain. It's a phase. He'll get bored of playing house with a waitress eventually. I stayed quiet. I smiled. I played the part of the devoted silent wife, but behind the scenes, I was working. You see, Judith thought she knew everything about me. She thought my past was a blank slate of poverty. She didn't realize that the charity project she was mocking was actually the person who had just spent the last 6 months quietly buying up the distressed debt of Miller Global. Jameson was a good man, but he was a terrible businessman. He let his mother handle the finances, and Judith was greedy. She had over-leveraged the company to buy a string of luxury hotels that were hemorrhaging cash. She was desperate. She was drowning. And she thought no one noticed. I noticed. I sat in that mansion for a year, listening to her insults. I listened to her tell me my shoes were cheap. I listened to her tell me I should unspeak at dinner parties because I didn't have the vocabulary to keep up with their guests.
I even stayed quiet when I found out she was trying to set Jameson up with his ex-girlfriend, a girl named Brianna who came from old money. Jameson needs a woman who understands his world. Samantha. Judith had told me one afternoon while we were alone in the garden. Not someone who's still trying to figure out which fork to use for the salad. Why don't you do us both a favor? Take a small settlement, I'll be generous and just disappear. He'll be sad for a week, and then he'll realize I was right. I just sipped my tea and looked at the roses. I'm not going anywhere, Judith. I love him. She leaned in close, her eyes narrowing into slits. We'll see about that. I always get what I want. And right now, I want you gone. She started planting seeds of doubt in Jameson's head. She'd accidentally leave photos of me talking to male colleagues on his desk. She'd whisper that I was only interested in when his father's trust fund would kick in. She'd sabotage my work, calling my boss, who happened to be an old friend of hers, and making sure my projects were stalled. By our first anniversary, the atmosphere in the house was toxic. Jameson was distant, torn between the mother he feared and the woman he loved. And Judith. She was ready for the kill. Which brings us back to that moment in the foyer. The drink in my face. The get out command. Jameson, I said, my voice trembling partly from anger, partly from the sheer adrenaline of what I was about to do. Are you going to let her do this? It's our anniversary. Jameson looked at me, then at his mother. He looked broken. Sam, maybe a break would be good? Mom says the tension is ruining the family business. Maybe if you just stayed at a hotel for a few weeks. Judith smirked. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had won. She had broken him. A hotel? Judith laughed. She can't afford a hotel. She'd be back in the slums where she belongs. She stepped closer to me, her voice a low hiss. You lost, you little rat! I own this house. I own this city, and I own my son. Now, get... I wiped the gin from my cheek with the back of my hand. I looked at Judith. Then I looked at Jameson. You're right, Judith, I said, my voice suddenly cold and steady. You do own this house. For now. But there is something you forgot to check when you were so busy looking down your nose at me. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope. What is that? Judith sneered. A bill for your services? Forget it. The prenup is ironclad. Oh, I'm not looking for a divorce settlement, Judith, I said, pulling out a set of documents. I'm looking for a return on my investment. I tossed the papers onto the marble table. That is a notice of foreclosure, I said, the words feeling like honey on my tongue. On this house, on your hotels, and on the Miller Global headquarters. Judith's face went from pale to a ghostly white in 3 seconds flat. That's impossible. We're in negotiations with the bank. The bank sold your debt, Judith, I smiled. To a private equity firm called Ariadne Holdings. Does that name sound familiar? She shook her head, her hands starting to tremble. No, I've never heard of it. That's because I started it 3 years ago, I said. With the inheritance my poor father left me. You know, the one you said didn't exist? Turns out he wasn't just a mechanic. He was the silent partner in the very firm that financed your husband's first build. And he left me everything. I stepped toward her, watching the fear finally start to flicker in her eyes. I didn't marry Jameson for your money, Judith. I have more money than you could ever dream of. I married him because I loved him. But you just lost the only thing you ever cared about. You can't do this, she stammered, grabbing the table for support. I already did, I said. And as the new majority owner of Miller Global, I think it's time for some changes. Starting with who lives in this house. The silence in the foyer was so heavy I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, a clock that, according to the documents in my hand, now technically belonged to me. Judith's mouth hung open, her perfectly lined lips trembling. She looked like a fish gasping for air in a tank that had just been drained. Ariadne Holdings? She whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. No, that's a multi-state investment group. They've been circling our hotel acquisitions for months. You're just a girl who grew up in a trailer park. You don't have that kind of reach. I let out a short, dry laugh. It wasn't Tia Robot's laugh, it was the laugh of a woman who had spent 12 months being called trash, while she was literally buying the ground Judith walked on. You see, Judith, that's your biggest flaw. You think wealth is something you wear like a costume. You think it's about the diamonds, the labels, the way you sneer at the waiter. But real power is quiet. Real power doesn't need to bark to let people know it's in the room. I walked over to the mahogany sideboard and poured myself a glass of that expensive gin she had just splashed on my face. I didn't care that it was 10 in the morning. I deserved a drink. My father, Thomas, he was a simple man. A mechanic, like I told you. But he wasn't just any mechanic. He was the man who fixed the cars and the problems of some very powerful people in New York. He didn't spend his money on flashy mansions or trophy wives. He invested every single cent. When he died, he didn't leave me a pile of debt and a failing ego. He left me a portfolio that makes your family's empire look like a lemonade stand. Jameson finally found his voice. He took a step toward me, his hand reaching out like he was trying to touch a ghost. Sam, honey, why didn't you tell me? If I knew we had this kind of backing, I wouldn't have let my mother. I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. The look I gave him was colder than the gin in my glass. If you knew? That's the problem, isn't it, Jameson? You only find your backbone when there's a profit margin attached to it. For a year, I watched you watch her destroy me. I watched you stay silent while she insulted my clothes, my upbringing, my very soul. You didn't protect your wife because you were afraid of losing your allowance. You chose the money. And now? Now the money is mine. Judith suddenly lunged forward, trying to grab the papers from the table, but I was faster. I tucked them under my arm and smiled. Don't bother. My legal team is already at the Miller Global headquarters. As of 9 a.m. this morning, all corporate accounts have been frozen pending a full forensic audit. And trust me, Judith, I know about the creed of accounting you've been doing with the Cayman accounts to hide the hotel losses from the board. She froze. Her eyes went wide. And for the first time, I saw real, unadulterated terror. She wasn't just losing her house. She was looking at potential prison time. You wouldn't, she hissed. Jameson is your husband. You destroy his name too? His name? I tilted my head. You mean the name you dragged through the mud by using it to bully everyone in the city? No, Judith. I'm not destroying the name. I'm cleaning it. I'm excising the cancer. And you are the tumor. I walked toward the grand staircase, my heels clicking sharply on the marble. Each step felt like a victory lap. I remembered the night of the charity gala 6 months ago, the night Judith accidentally spilled red wine down my back and then told the guests I was probably used to stains anyway. Well, I was done being a good sport. Where are you going? Judith shrieked, her voice cracking. This is still my house. You can't just walk around like you own the place. But I do own the place. I called back over my shoulder. Actually, I'm going upstairs to pack a bag. Not because I'm leaving, but because I'm moving into the master suite. You know, the one with the view of the lake? The one you told me I was too common to sleep in? You, on the other hand, have exactly 2 hours to pack your things. There's a lovely little motel on the edge of town. They have hourly rates. I think it'll suit your new budget perfectly. Jameson, do something. Judith screamed, turning to her son. Jameson looked like a man standing between a crumbling cliff and a raging sea. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. Sam, please. Let's talk about this. We're a family. We can fix this. I'll make her apologize. I'll make everything right. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down at him. The man I thought I loved. The man I had signed a prenup for because I wanted him to know I didn't care about his wealth. It's too late for apologies, Jameson. I didn't just buy your debt to save the company. I bought it to see who you really were, and today, I saw it. You stood there and watched her kick me out. You were ready to let me go back to the gutters as long as your mother kept the lights on. You don't love me. You love the comfort I provided by being your silent punching bag. I turned back to Judith, who was now leaning against the wall, looking like she might actually faint. Oh, and Judith, about that prenup you made me sign? The one that says I get nothing if we divorce? A tiny spark of hope flickered in her eyes.
Yes, it's ironclad. You signed it.
I did, I smirked. But you didn't read the fine print I added in the addendum my lawyers sent over. The one your distracted legal team signed without checking because they were too busy trying to cover up your bankruptcy. It states that in the event of proven corporate malpractice by the Miller family, the prenup is null and void, and I become the sole conservator of all family assets to protect the shareholders. I leaned over the railing, my voice a deadly whisper.
You didn't just lose your son's marriage today, Judith.
You lost everything you ever bullied someone to get. Now, get out of my house. Or should I call security and have you dragged out like the trash you are? I didn't wait for her answer. I walked into the master suite and shut the door. But I wasn't done. Not even close. You see, an empire doesn't just fall, it has to be dismantled, piece by piece. And I had a very long list of people who had helped Judith Miller make my life a living hell. And I was planning on visiting every single one of them. First on the list, Brianna. The old money ex-girlfriend who had been texting Jameson behind my back with Judith's blessing. I sat down at the antique vanity, looked at myself in the mirror, and picked up the phone. Hello, Brianna? I said when she picked up, my voice as sweet as poisoned honey.
This is Samantha.
I'm calling because I'm doing some restructuring at the club. And I've noticed your family's membership is currently under review for non-payment. Would you like to discuss it over coffee? My treat.
Since I know things might be a bit tight for you from now on. I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end. The game was officially on. Watching Judith Miller pack a suitcase was like watching a queen realize her crown was made of plastic.
She was frantic, throwing silk scarves and designer shoes into a Louis Vuitton trunk while muttering to herself about lawsuits and mistakes. But the more she packed, the more the reality sank in, the jewelry she was reaching for. Technically mine. The trunk she was filling.
Also mine.
Leave the diamonds, Judith, I said, leaning against the doorframe of her massive walk-in closet. I was holding a tablet with a real-time inventory list. The Miller family heirlooms stay with the estate. And since you've been using company funds to pay for your personal collection, well, consider them collateral for the millions you've bled from the firm. She spun around, her eyes bloodshot, her hair usually a perfect silver bob looking frayed. You're a monster! You're heartless!
Jameson, tell her.
Tell her she can't do this to your own mother. Jameson was standing in the hallway, looking like a ghost of the man I'd married.
He looked at me, then at the diamonds in his mother's hand. He didn't say a word.
He knew. He knew that if he opened his mouth to defend her, he'd be out on the street with her. He was choosing survival over loyalty. And honestly, it made me despise him even more.
He can't help you, Judith, I said, stepping into the room. Because Jameson is currently being investigated by the board for negligence.
If he wants to keep his junior vice president title, which, let's be honest, he only has because of his last name, he has to cooperate with me. I walked over to her vanity and picked up a heavy gold necklace, the one she wore to our wedding. The one she pointed at when she told me I'd never be fine enough for this family. I let it drop back onto the marble top with a satisfying clink.
2 hours, Judith.
The clock is ticking. And don't bother calling Brianna. She's busy. An hour later, I was at the Miller Global headquarters. The atmosphere was electric. People were whispering in the hallways. They knew something was happening.
The waitress bride was walking through the lobby not as a trophy wife, but as the owner.
I walked straight into the boardroom. 12 men in expensive suits, men who had ignored me at every company dinner, men who had laughed at Judith's jokes about my humble origins, all stood up. They looked confused, terrified. Gentlemen, I said, taking the seat at the head of the table. The seat Judith usually occupied. Sit down. We have a lot to discuss. And most of it involves why this company is currently $40 million in the red, despite your stellar management.
I spent the next 3 hours tearing them apart.
I didn't need a script. I had spent a year listening to Jameson vent about work, taking mental notes while Judith talked over me.
I knew where the bodies were buried.
I knew which hotels were losing money and which board members were taking kickbacks. By the time I was done, 3 of them had resigned for personal reasons, and the rest were looking at me like I was a firing squad. One more thing, I said, closing my laptop. I'm appointing a new chief financial officer. Someone who actually knows how to count. And as for the CEO position, well, Judith Miller is officially retired, effective immediately. The room was silent. I could almost hear their egos shattering. As I walked out of the building, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Brianna. You think you're so smart, Samantha? You're just a temporary glitch. Jameson doesn't love you. He's with me right now at the club. We're laughing at you. You can have the money, but I have the man. I smiled. She really was as predictable as a cheap soap opera. I hopped into my car, the one Judith told me. I wasn't allowed to drive because I might dent the prestige, and headed straight for the elite country club. The club was the epicenter of Judith's world. If you weren't a member here, you didn't exist. And Brianna? She lived for this place. She loved the way people bowed to her family name. I walked into the dining room, my head held high. I wasn't wearing the modest dresses Judith forced me to wear. I was wearing a blood-red suit that screamed power. I spotted them at a corner table. Jameson looked miserable, nursing a whiskey, while Brianna was draped over his arm, whispering in his ear and laughing loudly too loudly. She wanted everyone to see her winning. I walked right up to their table. The entire room went quiet. The clinking of silverware stopped. Jameson, I said, my voice calm and sharp. I thought I told you to stay at the house and help the movers. Brianna stood up, her face flushed with fake indignation. He doesn't have to listen to you anymore, Samantha. The cat is out of the bag. We know you're just a bitter little girl playing at being a CEO. Jameson is coming back to a real woman. I didn't even look at her. I kept my eyes on Jameson. Is that right, Jameson, you're leaving? Because I just finished the paperwork for your severance package. It's quite small. Since you've been using company accounts to pay for Brianna's spa weekends for the last 6 months. Jameson's face went white. He looked at Brianna, then back at me. Sam, I can explain. Don't bother, I snapped. Then I finally turned to Brianna. She was smirking, thinking she had the upper hand because she had the guy. And Brianna? About that coffee I mentioned? I lied. I don't want coffee. I just wanted to be here in person when the club manager delivers the news. Right on cue, Mr. Henderson, the club manager, approached the table. He looked deeply uncomfortable. Miss Brianna. I'm so sorry, he started, his voice hushed but audible to the surrounding tables. But we've had to terminate your family's membership. The unpaid dues have reached a limit we can no longer ignore. And, well, the new owner of the club's land lease has requested that you be trespassed from the premises. Brianna's smirk vanished. What? New owner? My father is on the board. Your father was on the board, I said, leaning in so only she could hear the ice in my voice. Until his firm went under this morning. I bought the land this club sits on, Brianna. Which means I'm the landlord, and I don't like the way you dress. It's a bit common, don't you think? The irony was delicious. The exact words Judith had used on me, now being fed to her golden girl. You can't do this, Brianna shrieked, her voice echoing through the silent dining room. I can, and I am, I said. I looked at the security guards standing by the door. Please escort this woman out. She's making a scene and ruining the atmosphere for the actual members. As the guards took Brianna's arms, she started screaming real ugly screams of a spoiled child who had finally been told no. Jameson tried to stand up to help her, but I put a hand on his shoulder. Sit down, Jameson, I whispered. If you walk out that door with her, you're walking out of the Miller legacy forever. No job, no trust fund. No house, just Brianna and her family's debt. Is she worth that much to you? Jameson looked at Brianna, who was currently being dragged toward the exit, her face contorted in rage. Then he looked at the caviar on the table. He sat back down. He didn't even look at her as she was kicked out. I felt a wave of disgust. This was the man I had loved. A man who wouldn't even stand up for his mistress once the money was gone. Good choice, Jameson, I said, patting his cheek. You're a coward, but at least you're a consistent one. Now, get up. We're going back to the mansion. Your mother should be finished packing by now, and I want to make sure she didn't accidentally take the silver. Driving back to the mansion felt different this time. For a year, every time I turned into that long, oak-lined driveway, I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I'd check my reflection, make sure my hair was perfect, make sure my meek smile was ready. I was walking into a cage, but today the gates opened because I owned the sensors. The gravel crunched under my tires like the bones of the empire Judith had tried so hard to protect. When I walked through the front door, the house was a mess. It was beautiful. Professional movers, the ones I hired, not Judith's friends, were hauling out the heavy mahogany furniture. Judith was standing in the center of the foyer, clutching a small silk jewelry roll to her chest like it was a life raft. "You're late!" she snapped, trying to summon her old authority. But her voice cracked. She looked smaller. Without the backdrop of her wealth, she was just an aging woman with a mean streak and too much Botox. "I had errands, Judith. Managing an empire takes time. You should know. Or maybe you shouldn't, considering you almost ran this one into a ditch," I said, tossing my keys onto the marble table. The sound echoed through the half-empty hall. Jameson trailed in behind me, looking like a whipped dog.
He went straight to his mother's side, but he wouldn't look her in the eye.
"Mom, it's over," he muttered. The lawyers confirmed it. The addendum in the prenup, it's legal. She has the controlling interest. Judith let out a sound that was half sob, half growl.
How did you do it, Samantha? You were a nobody. A waitress. A foster kid with nothing but a library card and a cheap suit.
I walked over to the grand fireplace, looking at the portrait of Jameson's father hanging above it. A man who had built everything, only to have his wife rot it from the inside out.
You're right about one thing, Judith. I was a foster kid.
But you see, the thing about growing up with nothing is that you learn how to listen. You learn to observe. You learn how to see the cracks in people before they even know they're breaking. I turned to face her, the firelight catching the steel in my eyes. My father wasn't just a mechanic. He was the man who kept the secrets of the most powerful families in the country.
He fixed their cars, sure, but he also fixed their problems.
And when he died, he didn't just leave me money. He left me a ledger. A ledger filled with 30 years of dirty laundry belonging to the elite of this city. Judith's face went a shade of gray I didn't think was possible. "I didn't choose Jameson because of the Miller name," I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I chose him because I knew you were the easiest target.
I knew your greed would lead you to overextend.
I knew your narcissism would make you underestimate me. I spent a year letting you insult me, letting you train me, letting you think I was a puppet. All while I was using my father's connections to buy up your debt from the very banks you were lying to. You planned this from the start."
Jameson gasped, his voice trembling.
"The coffee shop, the accidental meeting, it was all a lie?" I looked at him, and for a second, I felt a flicker of the girl I used to be. The girl who actually wanted to be loved. But then I remembered him laughing while his mother poured gin on me. I remembered him staying silent while she called me trash. The love was real, Jameson.
At least it was in the beginning.
I wanted to see if you were different from her. I gave you 1,000 chances to stand up for me, to be a man. To say, "Mother, stop. That's my wife." But you never did.
You were waiting for her to die so you could take the throne. Well, the throne is gone. And so is the queen. I stepped toward Judith and gently pried the jewelry roll from her hands. "This stays," I said firmly.
These were Jameson's grandmother's. They belonged to the estate. Not to a woman who is currently being sued for embezzlement.
"You can't leave me with nothing,"
Judith screamed, finally losing the last of her dignity.
She fell to her knees, her expensive skirt bunching up around her.
"I have nowhere to go. My friends, they won't help me if I'm poor."
Then I guess they weren't really friends, were they?
I shrugged, a lesson I learned at 6 years old. "You're just a late bloomer, Judith." I signaled to the 2 security guards waiting by the door. "Take her to the motel. I've paid for 1 week. After that, I suggest she looks into social services.
I hear the offices are lovely this time of year.
As the guards hoisted Judith up, her screams echoing through the house, Jameson stepped forward, his eyes hopeful. Sam, I'm so sorry. I'll make it up to you. I'll do anything.
I'll work for you. We can still be a power couple.
I know the business inside and out. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt nothing. No anger. No love.
Just a profound sense of relief that I was finally done with the Miller family rot. Oh, Jameson, you think you're staying? He blinked. Well, I'm your husband. The prenup addendum said you'd take the assets.
It didn't say I had to leave my home. I pulled a second envelope from my blazer pocket.
Actually, it did.
You see the same corporate malpractice that disqualified your mother? It also applies to you as a board member.
You've been served, Jameson.
Not just with an eviction notice, but with divorce papers. And since you signed that ironclad prenup that says you get nothing if the marriage ends due to infidelity or professional misconduct, I leaned in, smiling. And we both know about Brianna and those company-funded hotel rooms. You're leaving with exactly what I had when I met you.
A hoodie and a book. Though I think I'll keep the book. It was a first edition, and it's technically a company asset now. Jameson's jaw dropped. The realization finally hit him.
He wasn't the protagonist of this story. He wasn't even the villain. He was just a side character in his mother's play, and the play had just been canceled.
Get out, Jameson, I said, my voice cold as the grave.
Before I decide to hand over the files on your spa weekends to the IRS. I'm sure they'd love to know how you categorize those as business expenses.
Without another word, Jameson turned and walked out the door, his head hanging low.
No grand exit, no final fight. Just a pathetic walk down a long driveway he no longer owned. I stood in the center of the empty foyer. The silence was beautiful. But I wasn't done. The aftermath was just beginning. You see, when you take down a queen, you don't just leave a vacuum, you build something better.
And I had a city to redesign, starting with the very slums Judith had mocked.
I walked to the window and watched the car carrying Judith disappear around the bend. My phone rang. It was my lawyer. Samantha?
The press is outside the headquarters.
They want a statement about the hostile takeover. What should I tell them? I looked at my reflection in the window. I looked like the woman I was always meant to be. Tell them the Miller era is over, I said. And tell them.
Rebecca is just getting started. 6 months later. The air in Chicago was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and the distant hum of a city that never stops moving. I stood on the balcony of my new office, not the dark wood-paneled cave Judith used to occupy, but a glass-walled sanctuary on the 60th floor of the newly rebranded Ariadne Heights. The Miller Global sign had been taken down 3 months ago. Watching those giant gold letters being lowered by a crane was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. It wasn't just metal coming down. It was the weight of a year of psychological torture being lifted off my shoulders. I sipped my coffee. Black, no sugar, just the way I like it, and looked down at the blueprints on my desk. I wasn't building luxury hotels for people with more money than sense anymore. I was breaking ground on the Thomas Project. A complex of affordable housing, green spaces, and a vocational center for foster kids aging out of the system.
My father would have loved it. He always said that a foundation is only as strong as the people who build it.
But I didn't get here just by being the nice girl. I got here by being the woman Judith Miller taught me to be. Minus the cruelty. I had heard rumors about Judith, of course. In a city like this, gossip is the only thing that travels faster than money. After her week at the motel ran out, she tried to call in favors. She reached out to the friends she had spent decades impressing with her galas and her designer gowns.
But the elite are like vultures. They only circle when there's something to gain, and they vanish the moment they smell death. No one picked up the phone.
No one offered her a guest room. I decided to see it for myself. Call it petty. Call it closure. I call it a victory lap. I drove my SUV, the one I bought with my own earnings. Thank you very much, to a small, rundown laundromat on the edge of the city. I had heard she was staying in a studio apartment nearby, funded by a small state pension she'd forgotten she even had. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of cheap detergent and damp clothes. And there she was. Judith Miller.
The woman who once wore $3,000 silk suits was now wearing a faded tracksuit with a bleach stain on the leg. Her hair, once a masterpiece of high-end styling, was pulled back in a messy, graying ponytail. She was struggling with a heavy basket of laundry,
Her diamond-less fingers shaking as she tried to feed quarters into a machine that looked older than I was.
I didn't hide. I walked right up to her. She froze. The sound of the quarters hitting the metal floor was the only thing breaking the silence. She looked up, and for a second, I saw the old Judith, the one who wanted to spit in my face. But then, the fire went out. She looked tired. She looked old.
"Samantha," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its artificial elegance.
"Judith," I replied. I didn't sneer. I didn't need to. The reality around us did all the talking. "Have you come to gloat?" she asked, clutching her basket like it was the last thing she owned. "To see the trash in its proper place?" I looked around the dingy room, then back at her.
"I didn't come to gloat, Judith.
I came to give you something." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, plain envelope. She hesitated, then took it. Inside was a check. Not $1 million. Not even 100,000. Just enough to cover 6 months of rent in a decent, clean apartment and a few grocery bills.
"Why?" she asked, her eyes filling with tears she was too proud to let fall.
"After everything I did to you. After I tried to ruin you." "Because," I said, looking her straight in the eye,
"I'm not you."
"You spent your life trying to make people feel small so you could feel big. I spent my life building a chair for myself because no one would give me a seat at the table. I don't need to destroy you to be powerful, Judith.
You destroyed yourself the moment you decided that money was more important than humanity." I turned to leave, but I stopped at the door.
"Oh, and about Jameson," I said.
"I saw him last week. He's working as a junior clerk for a small firm in the suburbs. He tried to ask me for a loan."
I told him the same thing I'll tell you. The prenup was ironclad, Jameson. But the character you build after you lose everything?
That's the only thing that's truly yours. I walked out into the sunshine, feeling the warmth on my face. The Miller family was a ghost story now. A cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties about what happens when you underestimate the girl from the gutters. As I drove back to my office, I thought about the first day I met Jameson. I thought about the girl who believed in fairy tales and the woman who ended up writing her own ending.
To anyone out there watching their world crumble, or anyone feeling like they're being stepped on by people who think they're untouchable, remember this. The view from the top is great, but the climb?
The climb is where you find out who you really are.
And if you're patient, if you're smart, and if you're willing to play the long game, you won't just get your revenge. You'll get your life back. And that is the greatest victory of all. My name is Samantha, and this was the day I stopped being a victim
and started being the boss.